Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can find the show online at buildingthefutureshow.com or follow me on Twitter at buildingshow. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Lior Tamir, an entrepreneur, advisor, founder, and CEO of Accomplice. Lior, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to doing this. You have quite an impressive background, and maybe we should start off with where you grew up.
Sure. So, I was originally born in Israel. It's a tiny little country in the Middle East that always gets attention for the wrong things. But, immigrated to the United States when I was 5, and I settled down in the Bay Area. So I grew up in Foster City, and that's definitely had a huge influence on, just being around the tech community, how I kind of got involved.
Sure. So how did you guys end up in kind of the Bay Area?
It's an interesting story. My mother used to run the rehab unit in the main hospital in Hadassah in Jerusalem, and my dad's brother was a commando in the 1981 Lebanon War, and he was injured. He ended up being in a coma, and he was my mom's patient. At the time, my dad was serving in the military, but he was based in San Francisco, translating mechanical engineering books from English to Hebrew.
Oh, wow.
And so he was based out here during that time. When his brother got injured, he went back to Israel, and actually that's how my parents met. But then, they settled back down. They got married. Once we were born, I have a brother and a sister as well. There was continued, troubles in Israel in terms of violence and so on. And in 1991, there was the Gulf War. After the Gulf War, my parents decided that was enough, and that they were going to leave and immigrate to the United States. And when they did so, my dad had most of his contacts here in the Bay Area, and so it was just the only place that he knew people, and that was the reason we ended up here. So totally by random chance.
Sure. So no, that's awesome for you, especially being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, well, it's changed a lot. I think over the last 10 years, the entire Bay Area. Bay Area has always been known. Silicon Valley has always been known as the tech capital, but it's only become more and more pronounced, and so it worked out. It worked out great. I owe a lot to my parents.
Sure. No, so I'm curious then. Before we kind of get into your startup and what you were doing, you started off kind of as a jazz musician. Do you want to kind of tell the listeners kind of how you got into playing jazz?
Sure. So it's another one of those funny stories. My dad was a professional musician for many years, and growing up, the things that were important to my parents in terms of values to instill in us, one of the big ones was music. So instead of I didn't really play soccer or sports or things of the sort. I had to play music. I didn't really have much of a choice growing up. More and more so, that became more than just a hobby, and I ended up getting to the point that I could play decently well. I remember I had an instructor when I was in high school who forced me to try out for the state jazz band, and he forced me is key there, because it just really didn't seem like that was going to become my career. I ended up trying out. I ended up becoming the lead alto saxophone player for the state jazz band, and ended up doing some tours and playing with some pretty impressive musicians, and that became more and more the theme. When I ended up going to college, initially my core focus was around music, and by that time I had already spent a lot of time not just performing, but also in recording studios, mastering studios, working with audio engineers, and I was really fascinated by that entire space. I got into school, and there was an accident that happened in my personal life that kind of got me to take 2 steps back and rethink where I wanted to go with my life. And I decided that music was great as a hobby, but not necessarily a career. And that's when I switched over to the sciences.
Right, and that's when you became a dentist, or does that come later?
Yeah, so it's a few. that was a few steps. So. When I left, music as my core focus, I really ended up doing a lot of work in studying genetics. So I went to University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, And they have an amazing program for music. They also have an amazing program for just the sciences and also the dental school. So University Pacific Dental School is the top clinical school in the nation. It's based here in San Francisco, and it was just kind of a natural progression. I ended up studying genetics at University Pacific undergrad, and when I got out, my Jewish mother got on my case, and dentistry at the time seemed like the most logical next step. And I ended up applying and going to dental school to become a dentist. So that was the next step there.
So once you finished dentistry, how long were you a dentist for?
So dentistry has played a really important part of my life. Actually, my business partner and I, used dentistry essentially to not only establish ourselves, but also get to the point that we had some capital that we could invest into ventures that we wanted to. Practicing dentistry, I spent essentially as soon as I got out of school. So I graduated and I had finished all my clinical work and was licensed, ready to go by the end of 2009. At the time, there was, the economy was still kind of in a slump, and I was also extremely young in terms of when I finished. I was able to do all of that and finish by the time I was 23.
Oh,
and
wow.
So, I've always rushed things, not necessarily something that, I wish I could go back sometimes and have taken more classes around the arts and just things that interest me. But at the time, I just wanted to get through things. So I ended up wrapping up with school, and I was practicing part-time, just on a limited basis for many years. At first I was practicing maybe 3 days a week, then it became 2 days a week, then 2 days every other week, and so on, until I kind of established my entrepreneurial ventures and kind of was able to to set the dentistry aside. So I practiced on a part-time basis for maybe 3 or 4 years, and now occasionally I'll go into an office, but I don't practice anymore.
So then how did you get into technology, and what was kind of the driving factor to make you say, you know what, I really want to pursue this and move out of dentistry?
I would never, put myself in a box and say I was just a dentist or just a musician or just an entrepreneur. I think, since the earliest days in my life, business and just being an entrepreneur was kind of ingrained in me. My parents were entrepreneurs. In many aspects. I mean, they came to the United States with nothing, 3 kids and 5 suitcases, and that was a huge risk. But even in terms of business, my mom continued and ended up working at Stanford here, running their rehab unit. But my father always was an entrepreneur, starting businesses, and I learned a lot from that. And so, at an early age, I was already, whether it was selling things on eBay or selling my services, I was always an entrepreneur, and technology had also been a very important component of that. So, at an early age, I was taking computers apart, putting them back together, providing just general services in terms of getting systems set up. So, technology was always a very important component of being an entrepreneur, I guess in my case. When I was in dental school, so the last year and a half, it was right around then that I really started, thinking about, okay, well, what's next, and what do I really want to do with my life? And I started getting involved more so in the tech community and just technology in general. And I'd help. I did a little bit of work helping a team get a travel app going. I also had my own e-commerce store that I ran out of my apartment at the time. And when I got out of dentistry, as I mentioned, the economy was kind of in a slump. It was very difficult to get work as a practicing dentist, especially because in terms of my family, I didn't have any dentists that that were already established that I could go and get a job in an office. So technology, entrepreneurship became the only way to move forward. Technology was the area that I felt was where I could make the most impact, but also really pursue what was truly driving me, and that was kind of how I decided to go down that path. Now, in terms of being a technologist, I very much so understand the complexities of the technology, the different technologies that are available. I don't necessarily code myself, but it was a very conscious decision at the time, looking at what were my options, where was the economy growing, and just the general markets, and saying, okay, I really want to pursue and kind of spend my time and effort in technology.
No, I think that's awesome, and it sounds like you've had a passion for it for a number of years before you even started kind of anything really technology related, or like at least full time. Right out of becoming a dentist, or while you were still practicing being a dentist, did you start Accomplice, or kind of when did you start that up?
Sure. So Accomplice is, I would say, is my fourth tech venture. So Accomplice only came about we're about 2.5 years old now. But before I was building Accomplice, there was a few other ventures that that I had pursued. The one immediately before Accomplice was essentially a social listening platform. And at the time, this was kind of in the early days of social listening, before it became a lot more commoditized. But we were working on helping brands and marketers take vast amounts of text, so unstructured data, and be able to make sense of it. Using all kinds of data processing and natural language processing algorithms to kind of look at vast amounts of text, be able to process it and spit it back out in a way that a marketer, whether it's a brand marketer or someone working on a content strategy, could kind of slice and dice a conversation to better understand the qualitative insights. It's interesting is because when I took that to market, we were working with brands like Warner Music Group and Atlantic Records, and one of the things that we learned from this process was they were able to find really great and substantial insights from our solution, but taking those insights and then applying it to one sort of marketing effort, whether it was putting together a content strategy or better developing an audience for paid media efforts, that was kind of where the gap lied always with what we had brought to market and what the market really needed. And so, at the time, what we had decided to do was essentially wind that product down and that company down. And when I started Accomplice, there was a very specific goal, and we kind of went in with a specific problem that we were going to solve. So, I would say that Accomplice has been in development, or what we do at Accomplice was only possible because I had spent, the previous 3.5 years building, similar or technology in the similar space. Really understanding and learning from that, and then rebooting and coming back at the space with something that's truly valuable.
Right. Okay. So maybe let's talk about exactly what Accomplice does.
Absolutely. I always talk about what Accomplice does in the context of the problem that exists in the market. And so the problem that I always talk about is over the last 10 years we've seen a huge proliferation of channels in terms of how you reach consumers online. So if you rewind 10 years ago, it really was banner ads, so display advertising, and search engines. And then over the last 10 years, we've seen a proliferation of channels, a lot of it due to social, and then each one of those channels with their ad product. So we went from search engines and banner ads to now there's Facebook ads and Twitter ads and Instagram ads and Pinterest ads and LinkedIn ads, and Snapchat is rolling out ads, and Tumblr and so on. And this continues to only proliferate. As a marketer, in terms of the technology that you have available, most of that technology has been very reactive. So, Facebook ads launches, and then all of a sudden you have multiple or hundreds of third-party solutions to help you manage Facebook ads. And Twitter ads launches and the same thing. And what ended up happening is you have each one of these channels being managed in a complete silo. So as a marketer, if let's say you have a $50,000 budget and you want to drive whether it's app downloads or e-commerce purchases or whatever it might be, today there's a lot of manual work that happens in terms of thinking through how you should allocate your budget, building out campaigns and audiences, and then throughout the campaign process, you're launching and managing each one of these channels independently, using another solution like an analytic solution to kind of make sense of or get insights into, well, what is truly driving your actual conversions and the thing you care about, and what is it costing you? And then budget allocations are still done manually, so mixed models and things of the sort. So that's really the problem that Accomplice solves for, which is today to manage multiple paid channels is just a full-time job. And anyone who's actually stuck doing this, is spending hours upon hours jumping between different tools, analytics tools, using analysts to download all the data from each one of the individual channels and try to put together some sort of attribution story. So Accomplice solves for this. Today, Accomplice is the only solution that exists in market where you can set one budget with a goal. So you can tell the system, here's $50,000. I want to drive app downloads or app engagement or whatever it might be. Then we support multiple channels. You can build out your campaigns and audiences for each one, press a button, and what our system will do is not only set the bids and the budgets within each individual channel, optimize for performance there, but based on the performance in real time, it'll reallocate your budgets accordingly. So if it's seeing better performance from Facebook than Twitter, it'll shift money accordingly. Facebook to Google, and so on. And so what this really empowers the marketer to do is, worry less about, how do I actually manage the money once it's launched? How do I identify what are the best channels to drive the conversions? This essentially makes your marketing channel agnostic, where you can, be certain that there's a machine that, intelligently manages the money. It's always going to do it better, than humans can at scale, and that's really where the sweet spot is for our solution. So, that's the problem we solve, and that's kind of how it came about.
No, I think that's awesome, and I think that's kind of what fascinated me about your product is the fact that, I can set a budget, and then based on what's converting better, it kind of automatically moves, my budget around to the different networks, which I think you guys are the only ones doing it that I've seen, and I don't even think anybody's even doing anything remotely close to what you guys are doing. So that's why I wanted to have you guys on the show, because I think what you guys are doing is really, really awesome and super, super useful.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the interesting things is we always get asked, well, how did we pull this off? Or, how is it that no one else did? And we're talking about a space that's extremely crowded. You have 2,000 companies plus in the space that are, each trying to solve one part of the big challenge. And yet none of them has been able to bring to market a solution that does this specifically. And a lot of it really comes down to understanding what the technology is required to do. So, the approach that we took is we didn't just go out and build a tool to build your Facebook ads, your Twitter ads, your Google ads, and so on, but we built an entire analytics stack. So, in one system, we built a web analytics and mobile app analytics and user attribution suite, which serves as the one source of truth. So, what we're able to do because we have the analytics stack is we can create the campaigns, we can measure the results. There's a closed feedback loop there where now, because we have the user profiling stack behind the scenes, we can identify the same users as they interact with, let's say, a Facebook ad, a Twitter ad, a Twitter post, and whatever it might be. And then that, of course, informs the optimization. So we took a very holistic approach in terms of what the market needed. Instead of multiple tools, we kind of, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We took existing tools and how they're being used independently, brought them together, and the way that they're brought together and the optimization that sits on top of it, that's really the unique aspect of why we were able to pull this off.
Sure. No, I think that's really good. And just for the listeners out there, it's accomplice.io is the website, and I'll post it in the show notes as well as a few other links. But just for people listening, it's accomplice.io. So I'm curious to know some lessons that you've learned from kind of doing this startup and your previous startups, kind of good or bad.
Sure. Startups are quite the beast. I think that there's a quote that I once read where it talked about what it feels like to be in a startup, and I think the way it described it was being in a startup or running a startup is kind of like essentially sitting on a line or riding a line where when you're on top of it and it's moving forward, it feels amazing, but then sometimes it'll turn around and just bite you. Startups are a very challenging. Any company really to get started is a startup, and that's always a challenging thing to do. I do work with a lot of startups in terms of just advising them and helping them think through their challenges. I would say that the one mistake that I usually see startups make more so than everything is just the validation process, right? There's so much importance in terms of before you get started, whether it's a food startup and you're making a meal or a technology startup and you're building a product, in terms of a startup, you have to make sure that whatever it is that you're building truly has a purpose and is truly solving a problem. And I see so many startups that, are building novel technology but didn't really spend the time to validate up front and really do the research and identify, what is it that they're trying to solve, how valuable is it to whoever they're trying to solve for, and how much are they really willing to pay for it if they were willing to pay for it at all, right? So it's really the difference between being a vitamin or a painkiller. And I think that more so than all the other mistakes that I see startups make, that's the one that I think is most important. And what I've learned, and I've taken my own advice in terms of, I made a similar mistake in my previous companies where, I hadn't taken the time to truly validate, interview, talk to people, and make sure that, what I was solving was what needed to be solved. So I would say that's probably the most important lesson. At the end of the day, startups are just people, and I know people talk about this, and it sounds very cliched, but your team and the people that you get to do this with are everything. Because there's always going to be ups and downs, there's always going to be challenges, but it really comes down to having the right people there, not only just to support you, but also pull off whatever the startup is trying to do that eventually defines the success.
No, I think those are really good. And I think people forget about that all the time. It seems like a lot of people just want to build these little, or turn like a feature into a company, and then they kind of wonder why they fail. So I think that's really good advice to validate an idea, and especially when you've been through it yourself, right?
Absolutely. There is a book that I always recommend called The 4 Steps to Epiphany. It's the Bible for thinking through. And I think that, the context of the book is written in terms of kind of technology products, but you can apply that to anything, right? You can really apply the validation process and thinking through that to any business. And I can't overemphasize, how important that step is.
Is there any other tips that you'd give people for kind of validating their idea? Like, do you just ask friends and family online? Kind of how do you go about validating an idea?
So, I would say validation has to be very contextual to whatever it is that you're trying to do. If you are, for example, in our case, right, with Accomplice, we were building a solution for marketers and a very specific type of marketer. So marketers that are, spending money online, required to do the analysis, the attribution, and so on. So, before we touched any line of code or even, thought about that, we spent about 3 months just interviewing hundreds of marketers and media buyers and media managers and media planners. And so, a lot of the research that we did was very contextual to the industry. So I would say, no matter what it is that you're trying to do, the validation should be very specific to that. So, if you're trying to, get a hair care line out, right, you're going to want to talk to people that work in salons or professional hair care that might get that feedback or provide that feedback to you. And the way that, validation, sometimes you don't even know what you're looking for, right? And so it's very important that when you design validation interviews out, right, the questions are broad but still very centered and contextual to what you're trying to solve. And it requires being an exceptional listener and really picking up on, the challenges and understanding the workflow that someone is faced with, the challenges that are specific to that workflow, and then, of course, validation is not also a process that just ends at you do it at first and then you stop. Validation has to continuously happen as you're bringing something to market. Once you go through the first set of validation interviews, you might have a pretty good sense of what it is that you need to build. The next step then is to, start prototyping something. And as you do that, constantly getting the feedback, the validation, and making sure that, this is exactly the direction that you're supposed to be going. This is what you're supposed to be solving. And if you do it and do it successfully, people will pay you money for it.
Oh, I think that's really awesome advice. So I'm curious then, is there anything that you wish you did differently with Accomplice, or just based on your history, you're pretty happy with how things are going so far?
I think as an entrepreneur, you have to learn not to have regrets and work and move forward. Personally, as an entrepreneur, I can tell you that I'm very much self-aware, and I audit everything I do on a regular basis. And so, there's not much I can look back and say, man, I really wish I did that different. Other than, I would say the biggest advice in terms of thinking through that would be, or at least from my experience, would be, sometimes when you don't have the right people, I wished I had let them go earlier rather than trying to find excuses or ways to make it work with them. And so, one of the important things that I always tell entrepreneurs is, what you got in the bank and the team that you have, that is really the only tools that you have. So you really need to make sure that A, you're spending your money right, and B, that you have the right people. And even if you have an inkling that the person that you have on your team, for whatever role it might be, is not the right person, you have that gut feeling where, you're not seeing the results, my most important advice is to cut your losses and rethink that component of your business. So, in terms of what I wish I had done differently, of course, validation, right? But I think that comes from a level of cognition and kind of experience. The second would be really, being able to identify what's working, what's not working in your business, and making decisions faster rather than finding excuses or trying to find ways to make it work. The third, I would say, is get your legal documents in order. So I actually have had a lot of experience with legal documents that I didn't have done right, and cost me a lot of time, effort, money, pain, and so I would say those are the three things that as I made mistakes as an entrepreneur, I look back and say, oh well, I probably should have done that differently.
I think you touched on a really important point here is the legal documents. So what would you recommend to people that they should have kind of in place, kind of at the beginning and maybe even later on in a startup?
Sure. So, again, depending on what type of startup or company that you're trying to build, there's so much variation there, right? There's a great book that I read early on. I think it's called Venture Deals. I'm pretty certain that's what it's called. But essentially, there's so many things to think through. What is the corporation structure? Is it an LLC, an S corp, a C corp? If you're going down the technology company route, it's typically going to be a C corp so that you can have different types of stock. But the biggest mistakes always come down to contracts, right? And if you think about the purpose of a contract, the contract is supposed to be a formal document that outlines what each side of the agreement, what each party is going to be doing. And over the years, I've learned to think about contracts in the context of let's write out every single possible scenario, or within reason, of things that could go right and wrong, and then design the contract around that to address how both parties would want to deal with each one of those scenarios. So contracts should really have a purpose. I would say getting your corporate structure, and making sure that that's right is critical. But contracts can be everything in context of, having an employee with a vesting schedule, or a co-founder even with a vesting schedule, all the way to, how do you write the right type of contracts with customers to ensure that liabilities is shared across the board or on your end, depending on business, accordingly. So, contracts, I know a lot of entrepreneurs, just because there's so much typically that they have to do, sometimes they get overlooked or done improperly, or, corporate governance hasn't been kept up to date. I can't stress this enough. It's so critical to have, the right legal documents and really cleaned up corporate governance in place to scale and kind of operate a successful business.
No, I think that's really, really good advice, because you're right. I think a lot of people do forget about that, even especially early on, or if it's like two guys doing it kind of just in the evening, or girls, I should say, they forget about that stuff, right? And you never know if something's going to take off, and you're like, oh, we didn't set all this up properly. And I've seen where people get in some pretty big fights over it and whatnot. So it makes sense just to kind of cover yourself and your partners and your employees and even your customers, right?
Absolutely. And, one of the things that I tell advisors, and I also partake in this, is, I've learned over the years that having the right advisors is so, so important. In my career, I've had, several different advisors, but I've had one specific advisor who's essentially been kind of like my CEO coach. And, He's the guy that I call whenever shit hits the fan, but he's the type of guy that, can give me advice on, how I go about my the legalities and how things get structured and so on. So having someone that has been there, done that, and you can really depend on them to get the right type of advice is something that's super important and something that I would suggest to all entrepreneurs out there.
Sure. No, I think that's really good advice. And it seems anybody that I've had on the show so far, pretty much all of them have mentioned about how important having an advisor or mentor is and has been to their success. And so I'm curious to know, I know you advise some companies, but I'm curious to know, what do you look for when, trying to find an advisor, and what do you look for as an advisor?
Well, I think what are you looking for when you're trying to find an advisor is pretty simple. You have to identify what it is that you want advice on, right? So, if it's general day-to-day CEO kind of stuff, or how do you run a company, you want to find someone who's been there.
Sure.
And done that. If it's something related to product, if you're looking for advice on, how do I design a product, and how does UI UX kind of play into the the engagement within a product? Well, you're going to want someone that has done that in that context, right? A UI UX designer, or someone with expertise and can provide and kind of shine the light on the areas that you might need advice. So in terms of when you are looking for an advisor, it's really important to know what you're trying to get advice on, and then finding the people that are accredited or have the chops and the experience to be able to provide that advice. In terms of me, when I look for companies that I advise, a lot of it, it comes down to two things. What is the company doing, and do I really believe that there's a proper or there's an appropriate market that's large enough, and also that their solution is designed to solve that challenge, and B, of course, it's the entrepreneurs, right? So being an entrepreneur requires a lot of sacrifice, an immense amount of focus, and just you have to be resilient. And so I really look for entrepreneurs that I know are not going to get cold feet 3 months in or a year and a half in and kind of and give up when things get tough. So if I'm already going through the process to invest my time to help someone out, I just want to make sure that they want to help themselves and also take this all the way.
Sure. So when you're advising companies, are they usually local, or you kind of will advise somebody that you could potentially never meet because they're, across the globe or in another part of the country?
So I've definitely advised companies remotely. I always do think that there's immense amount of value in meeting at least once or twice in person, because business is so much about people. So it's very rare that I will work with a business remotely, but it's not to say never, right? So I think that's it really depends more so on the opportunity, what the entrepreneur is trying to achieve, and how global do they need to be, and there's always opportunities to work with people even if it's remote, and technology makes that easier.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I've always kind of wondered, when you're advising companies, you give your time, do you potentially give any money, or do you get any like stock options or a percentage of the company, or is it kind of really up to the company and the advisor?
It's definitely totally up to the company and the advisor, and it depends also on what is the skill set that quote-unquote advisors bring to the table. For a startup, it's usually easier to give up equity. And then again, I think if you're doing an engagement purely on equity, you really want to make sure that there's still expectations, because when you're not exchanging money, sometimes it feels like it's a little bit more casual. But again, in terms of whether you go cash or equity or a combination of the two, it really depends on who the advisor is, what can they bring to the table, how badly you need them, and how much do they need the money versus how much do they believe in the vision. So there's no real rules. I would say you have to kind of look at your situation in terms of the company, right? So, if the company is equity rich and cash poor, then it's probably going to try to identify the right people, get them excited enough, and bring them on as equity-based advisors. The one thing that is also critical is to really have a focus of the advisory, relationship. So many times there's advisors that are brought on, maybe just for intros or something of the sort. But even in that context, right, you need to make sure that there's expectations on both sides. They're clearly communicated, documented, of course, legally, in some sort of agreement, and then just regular check-ins and very transparent communication.
Sure. No, I think that's awesome. And I've always kind of been curious about that myself. So I think my listeners would be curious about that as well. So I think that's really good advice. So in kind of wrapping up the show a little bit, I'm curious to know if you can maybe give anybody advice on kind of marketing their companies, any do's and don'ts.
Sure. Well, we can spend hours on that, but the marketing is an interesting thing. I think many companies, brands, entrepreneurs, sometimes don't understand how marketing really plays in. And marketing has so many different meanings. It could be everything from brand marketing to performance marketing to press, whatever it might be. As a company, or if you're trying to do marketing for an entity X, right, you have to really think about the funnel, not so much as just what's happening online, but, how are people hearing about you, right? So, in terms of marketing, every stage of a company requires a different type of marketing. At the really early stages, it requires, a lot more content and kind of being able to articulate your value proposition in a really powerful and succinct and articulate way. As you kind of build a reputation, kind of have more of a presence online, then the next step is, okay, now we got to kind of have a funnel that's working already. How do we take things to the next level? And there's all kinds of ways around that, and it includes quality content, activating using paid media, and so on. So I would say that there's a few mistakes that I usually see companies do. One is, they don't really understand what phase they're at and kind of what appropriate marketing is required. The one thing that I always tell people is digital marketing is not a solution. Is not something that will help if you don't already have your messaging kind of in place, a story that you're telling, and already something that's working. So I'll give you an example. I've worked with companies in the past where I'll walk into their operation and see that they're selling $10 shampoo for $15 and also have $15 in shipping. So the shipping is more expensive than the shampoo, and they're not necessarily sure why they're not able to get conversions. And they've tried paid advertising, but again, nothing is leading to convert. And so that's a typical scenario where I'll go in and ask them even the logical questions. Well, paid marketing is not going to help until that part is figured out. And let's say they'll end up changing the strategy. In this case, it was they gave away free shipping. They started to see a lot more conversions or actual conversions, and then paid advertising can kind of supercharge or turbocharge that, right? So in terms of marketing, it's so critical to first identify what are you trying to achieve, what is that goal, right? Then it's really making sure that you have the right measurement tools in place to be able to, to kind of see what's happening. And then marketing is really, should be practiced as a scientific process, right? You have a hypothesis. It might be, if you do Facebook ads, you'd be able to sell shampoo X or product Y or get people to sign up for your newsletter. And then marketing should really be practiced as a bunch of small tests, right? Whether it's tests on content, on targeting, on copy, on native ads, press releases, and so on. Then of course measuring how all those different efforts or tests that you're running are driving or impacting the bottom line, and honing in on what's working and dialing that in. So marketing should be very goal oriented. There's a lot of technology out there, so really understanding how the technology is related to the phase that you're in, having the right measurement stack in place, and then of course running a bunch of experiments to identify what's working.
Sure. No, I think that's awesome advice. And it sounds like you're trying to solve a lot of those problems and are solving a lot of those problems with Accomplice.
We definitely have a long way to go, and I would say that as our product continues to evolve, there's going to be so much more that we're going to add. But yeah, we're definitely taking a very important chunk of where I would say the most where mistakes are the most expensive, and solving for that first, and then continuing to branch out and hopefully eventually get to the point that we're an entire top of the funnel stack.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And so maybe just kind of in closing here, let's share any other advice that you'd have for aspiring entrepreneurs.
I would say that's a good one. So, we talked about teams. We talked about making sure that you validate and solve a problem. Entrepreneurship is so much about resilience and solving problems. And don't give up is something that's critical. You really have to almost tailor your life to the experience that you're about to embark on. There's so many ups and downs. There's been times where I've had to couch surf, and times where I've had to max out my credit card to maintain the company or keep the company afloat. So being an entrepreneur is definitely not an easy thing. I would say it's more challenging than just about anything out there. And so, really be dedicated, understand that resilience is key. Your network is so important. And not just a network where someone or bumped into them once and you got a LinkedIn connection, but having a group or a network, and of course this takes years to develop, but the right people that you can call up and ask for help or ask for advice or ask for introductions. So having a well-established network, I think as an entrepreneur, you have to become a power networker, which is a critical component. And that's kind of what comes to mind.
No, I think that's really great advice. So just kind of to close the show, let's promote a little bit where people can find you online. There's, of course, accomplice.io, but maybe if you want to share any other sites or social media links, and I will post these in the show notes as well.
Sure. So I guess I'm kind of an anomaly. I mainly use LinkedIn. So whether it's connecting with me there, sending me notes, I've started to use Twitter more so. But in general, I'm quite a private person. I do most of my posting and publications either through the company, so Accomplice, or on LinkedIn. And so that's probably the best way to reach me.
No, that's great. And sadly we're out of time, so we're gonna have to close it there. But this has been awesome, and I really, really do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to do the show. And yeah, I'm sure the listeners are really going to enjoy this. So again, thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thanks so much. Appreciate it, and looking forward to continue to support what you're doing. Love the show.
Thanks, man. We'll talk soon. Okay, take care. Bye.
Ciao.
Thanks for listening. You can visit past shows at buildingthefutureshow.com. If you're going to the Startup Expo on February 16th and 17th in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and want to record an episode, please contact me. The music for the show is by Electric Mantra. Check them out at electricmantra.com. Until next time, keep building the future.